Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Nazi who escaped justice for 15 years before his trial brought global understanding to the term Holocaust. Under oath, Eichmann insisted he was a middle manager with no blood on his hands.
Dass ich nie einen Menschen getötet habe, dass ich nie einen Menschen erschlagen habe, dass ich nie einen Menschen geschlagen habe.
Is this the truth, or were his words all lies? Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. It is interesting weighing up the different sides of this. I find this is an extremely tough one because he played such an integral role to the Nazi genocide, but at the same time, because he was a cog in that machine, maybe he was replaceable.
What I find most interesting about Eichmann is the pedestrian nature to which he went about his work. To him, it was just automated. He went to work, he did his job, he went back home.
You have to remember, he wasn't a senior Nazi. That uniform is that of an SS lieutenant colonel. That's not that high. It's middle ranking.
When anti-Semitic measures were increased and persecution was ramped up, he was on board. A genocidal regime doesn't just need speech makers, doesn't just need people ranting at the podium, it doesn't just need politicians, it needs organizers, people who make plans and carry them out.
Eichmann was one of several senior Nazis to escape punishment after World War II. He vanished into thin air before being spotted in Argentina in the late 1950s. He was captured in secret and brought to Israel to face his accusers. His trial lasted for 4 months and was watched by millions around the world. Throughout, Eichmann claimed he was purely an administrator who played no direct part in the mass genocide his Nazi bosses carried out. I want to know if there is any truth to his defense, so I've come to Germany to start looking into Eichmann's story at a place that helped take him down.
That's the map. Nearly every spot here is a crime scene.
Wow. Jens Rommel is a prosecutor at the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes on the outskirts of Stuttgart.
It's an amazing visual representation of the scale and scope of Nazi crimes.
And it's only a part of the scale.
So it must be a very daunting task for you then, because you've got all these crime scenes here, and you're trying to bring the people who are responsible for this to justice.
It's an enormous task for a small office like ours.
70 years on, Jens and his team are still chasing down suspected war criminals from the Third Reich. They have identified some 28,000 war crime sites, but with many of the men and women under suspicion now in their 90s, time is running out.
These crimes happened 7 decades ago, but your office is investigating these crimes today.
Well, of course, these are historical events during World War II, but what we are doing are current investigations because the defendants, some of them, are still alive, and it's also important for the victims or their relatives. For them, that's a current issue. Let's move to the card index room. We have 1.7 million index cards with names, locations, and military units.
1.7 million?
1.7 million. More than 700,000 names of defendants or witnesses.
From Hitler down to the lowliest thug, the details of their crimes are recorded here.
So I'm interested in finding out more about Eichmann. Do you have anything on him here?
Well, there should be a file concerning him, but first we have to check on the index cards. That's his index card. You can see we have a lot of cards concerning him, 8 in total.
8 cards. Is that unusual?
That's unusual because he was such a prominent figure responsible for a lot of victims. You have his personal data, Adolf Eichmann, and his actual position as the head of a unit in the Reichssicherheitshauptamt responsible for the killings and the robbery of Jewish citizens.
But as a bureaucrat who spent the Second World War behind a desk, he wasn't well known among Nazi hunters when the conflict ended.
In post-war Germany, the process of denazification undertaken by the Allies quickly became a lower priority than preparing for the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. So there was little appetite in post-war Germany to find and prosecute war criminals, especially those who weren't at the very top of the regime.
This allowed Eichmann, along with many others, to slip through the net. It really blows my mind. Hundreds of thousands of people have blood on their hands, and some of them are still out there. Eichmann, however, was one of the highest profile escapees to be caught. The arrest brought to light his astonishing story. To find out more about how he got his start with Nazism, I'm heading 620 kilometers northeast to Germany's capital, Berlin. Historian Dr. Stephanie Fischer is taking me to where Eichmann's career under Adolf Hitler would flourish. He actually went to the same high school as Adolf Hitler. Is that true?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, it seems to be kind of surprising for us, right? And we immediately start thinking, is there a connection? But it just doesn't seem that they met us.
Yeah, it wasn't like it was a school notorious for, say, radicalizing people or anything like that.
Not that we would know.
Born in 1906, Eichmann is 17 years younger than Hitler, so their paths never crossed in the halls of their high school in Linz, Austria.
Eichmann was a nondescript adult, and he had a nondescript childhood. He left vocational school without completing his course of study as a mechanic. He worked with his father, he worked as a sales clerk, incredibly nondescript and undistinguished.
And do we know why Eichmann became so interested in right-wing politics?
I think what he really finds appealing about is this idea of comradeship, of belonging, having a group of male bonding and being together and drinking beer and having common goals about how to change the world. And part of it is, of course, anti-Semitism.
So why was anti-Semitism part of his worldview?
As crazy as it may sound to us today, it wasn't something very uncommon at the time. Like right after World War I, among leftists and rightists as well, we would have a high degree of anti-Semitism. It wasn't something unique to the Nazi movement at the time, but the Nazism they pushed it to a new degree.
The Nazis' propaganda machine spouting Jewish conspiracies feeds right into Eichmann's pre-existing anti-Semitism. He joins the SS in 1932.
In 1933, Eichmann was sent to Dachau for paramilitary training, and he wasn't very excited by it. He requested a transfer to the SD, the security service of the SS, and a transfer to Berlin. He was ambitious and he wanted to rise up in the party, but not through the military route.
In Berlin, he is posted to the very center of Hitler's security apparatus. I actually have a picture of the original building.
Oh, let's take a look.
Yeah. So this is a photo of the building that was standing here before.
Exactly. So this used to be the headquarters of the SS, the security service SD, Gestapo.
The SS was Hitler's security service, the Gestapo his secret police, and the SD the intelligence wing where Eichmann worked.
The SD is going to become one of the most powerful organizations in the Third Reich. It's there to gather every scrap of intelligence about every enemy. Now, those enemies don't just include foreign powers, they also include the other perceived enemies, such as Jews, communists, members of the church, Freemasons, you name it. Anybody Hitler doesn't like, they are a fair target for the SD.
What were his responsibilities
He was very much involved in collecting data from Jews, but in particular in setting up emigration plans for how Jews should leave Germany. It's a major project. I mean, just think about it. This is where he proves to be a very good bureaucrat.
The Nazis' first attempt at removing Jews from Germany involved racist, restrictive policies that pushed them to emigrate. Eichmann was given the task of coordinating this effort through the SD, and he dove headfirst into the job.
Why is it that he is willing to work in an institution that is persecuting people? Like, why is it that he comes in, he gets a desk job, I understand that he wants to get away from the military service, but then he's persecuting Freemasons, and then he's persecuting Jews. Like, what is it about him that drives him to do that?
We can only read the documents we have, and the documents show that he chose to work there, and it was not something forced on him. So he made a clear choice to work in this department that persecuted Jews.
At his trial, Eichmann conceded that this was where he first honed his skills as an expert administrator, though remained adamant he was nothing more.
Das waren meine inzwischen mir angelernten Fähigkeiten auf dem Gebiet des Auswanderungswesens. So konnte ich sehr wohl jene Zeit auf diesem Gebiet als Spezialist gelten.
But the historical record proves there was much more to his story. In 1938, after Germany annexes Austria, Eichmann is posted to Vienna. He sets up the Central Office for Jewish Emigration and gets straight to work hounding the Jews in the country where he grew up.
He was an expert in what we would call putting the squeeze on people. Eichmann took steps, especially in Vienna, to compel emigration, to make life for Jews so difficult and so unlivable, and to have the threat of terror hanging over them, that they would have no choice but to find some way to flee the country.
Eichmann dreams up financial scams to seize Jewish property and freeze their assets. In May 1938, he boasts to his colleagues, "I have them completely in my hands. They dare not take one step without first consulting me." In just 1 year, Eichmann forces 100,000 Jews to leave Austria. It's an act no one should endure, not back then, nor today.
Dass keiner freiwillig ihre Heimatland und wo man aufgewachsen ist und ihre Umgebung verlässt.
I'm on a quest to figure out where Adolf Eichmann fits into Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to Berlin, the city where Eichmann honed his skills overseeing the forced emigration of Jews from Europe. At his trial in 1961, Eichmann claimed he wasn't high enough in the chain of command to have any influence over what happened to them.
Denn dazu war mein Dienstgrad zu klein und meine Dienststellung zu gering.
But his success in pushing thousands of Jews out of Austria suggests otherwise. In fact, Eichmann and the Nazis were just getting started.
Eichmann's role in the SD is to identify ways in which the Jews can be got rid of. What we're looking at is forced emigration, plunder of wealth and property.
With Eichmann's help, from the mid-1930s onwards, Jews and other perceived enemies of the state were being persecuted to such a degree they had no choice but to leave their homelands, only to discover their situation became even worse.
There was no place for Jewish refugees to go. Many countries' doors were closed to them.
In one famous example, in May 1939, an ocean liner carrying some 900 Jewish refugees left Germany in search of a home. The St. Louis was denied entry to Cuba, the United States, and Canada, and forced to return to Europe. Over 250 passengers were later killed in concentration and death camps. I want to find out what fleeing that kind of tyranny feels like. Since the Second World War ended, Germany has become far more welcoming to refugees.
How long have you lived in Germany?
Ich bin seit mehr als 38 Jahren in Deutschland.
And though I can't speak to those who are aboard the liner, I can speak to people who've endured similar torment.
Ich bin ein Jahr nach iranischer Revolution.
Hamid Novzari is the director of Berlin's Society for Iranian Refugees, a group that supports newly arrived asylum seekers.
Die neue politische Machthaber im Iran und neue politische Lage war für mich unerträglich. Ich konnte nicht mehr aushalten und deshalb bin ich mal rausgekommen.
After the revolution in 1979, Iran devolved into totalitarian rule. Persecution of political opponents and minority groups became government policy. Just as Adolf Eichmann used the terror apparatus to push Jews out, Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, intimidated his people into submission. Many were forced to abandon the country of their birth.
Why do refugees come to Germany? What conditions are they fleeing?
Sehen sich gezwungen, ihre Heimat zu verlassen, sei es politisch, Hunger, keine wirtschaftliche oder Lebensperspektive, aber auch viele wegen ihrer Geschlecht, als Beispiel Frauen, Homosexuellen, als Beispiel Iraner, mehr wegen religiöser Diktatur, Unfreiheiten, Syrien, Bürgerkrieg. Wenn sie aus Afghanistan kommen, da haben die de facto keine Perspektive. Entweder wenn die aus Dörfern sind und so, werden die eventuell von Taliban und anderen Paramiliten.
In 2015, more than 1 million refugees fleeing civil war, political persecution, and economic hardship flooded into Europe. In response, Germany opened its borders.
How do you think Germany's history affects their attitude towards refugees?
Ich glaube sehr viel in Bezug auf die Vergangenheit von Deutschland, sich verpflichtet fühlen, sich für die Minderheiten, für Flüchtlinge einzusetzen, dass keiner freiwillig ihr Heimatland und wo man aufgewachsen ist und ihre Umgebung verlässt.
The kind of state-sanctioned persecution Hamid is describing resonates with Eichmann's work. In 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. This gives Eichmann an even greater challenge.
It becomes increasingly obvious that the more territory you conquer, the more Jews are going to be under your control. So when the Nazis do march into Poland, suddenly they got 3 million more Jews. Now, what are you going to do with them?
Ever the problem solver, Eichmann's policies escalate from forced emigration to deportation. And one of his pet projects for what to do with the Jews was truly bizarre.
If you want to get to the roots of basically crazy Nazi thinking, look no further than the Madagascar plan. Big island off the coast of Africa. Nazis look at the map and go, well, why don't we just dump the Jews there?
Eichmann assembles a task force to plan mass deportations from Nazi-held Europe to the French colony. But the plan's impracticality during wartime doomed it to failure.
It's completely insane. There's no infrastructure there, and of course, it makes no sense. If you're going to dump a load of people on that island, well, actually, you might as well kill them. Someone makes that mental leap, and that's what's going to happen.
This is a planned genocide through an industrialized mass murder program. It's deeply disturbing.
The next leg of my journey into Adolf Eichmann's story brings me to a villa in the leafy Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The setting is beautiful, yet the events that took place here over 75 years ago were anything but.
So this really is a stunning property.
Many people tell me that they are shocked by the contrast between the beauty of this place and the horrific history which we tell in our exhibition.
Today, this former SS guest house is a memorial site for European Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Hans Christian Josch is the director.
Now, this property is most notorious for a meeting that took place here in January 1942. Can you tell me what that meeting was for?
The basic idea of the conference was to coordinate government offices on what the Nazis euphemistically called the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jewish question.
Undoubtedly, many conferences took place in the Third Reich throughout the war about how genocide was going to be enacted. The one that we know the most of, because the minutes of it were discovered, is the Wannsee conference. This was a business meeting discussing, sales targets, what it looked like to an outsider. You had a map, you had numbers, and you had where those numbers were going to go. But of course, what all those numbers and maps represented was industrial slaughter.
This was where a small group of key Nazis agreed to the coordinated mass extermination of European Jews. Eichmann was among them. At his trial, Eichmann acknowledged he attended the Wannsee conference, but claimed he played no part in that decision. He even went as far as saying he was opposed to the violence.
Ich hatte im Hinblick auf Juden damals nur jene Obliegenheiten zu erfüllen, die mit der Auswanderung zusammenhingen. Und zwar lediglich in fahrplanmäßiger Hinsicht, das heißt transporttechnischer Hinsicht. Aber ich hatte an keine blutige Lösung gedacht und nicht an eine solche gewaltsame Lösung gedacht.
Of all the claims he made in court, his fate hinged on this one more than any other.
So what was Eichmann's role in the conference?
Eichmann was the head of the desk for Jewish affairs in the Reichssicherheitsamt, in the Reich's main security office, and he was therefore in charge of transport.
All of the deportations from Nazi-ruled Europe to concentration and death camps in the East were overseen by Adolf Eichmann.
What was it about him that gave him such an important role in the Nazi genocide?
Eichmann took a lot of initiative, that he would actually interpret orders from his superiors very sort of flexible way, that he even had been reprimanded sometimes for being overzealous.
Eichmann worked tirelessly to maximize the efficiency of the train timetables. The gas chambers at Auschwitz couldn't keep up with the number of people he was sending. By 1944, even with the Allies advancing on all fronts, Eichmann continued to wage his own war against the Jews.
When the deportation of the Hungarian Jews started in spring 1944, he was actually overstepping Himmler's orders and sort of developed his own ambition in deporting as many Jews as possible.
As the Third Reich begins to crumble, he forces thousands of Hungarian Jews to march to the camps. When Heinrich Himmler ordered a stop to the death marches, Eichmann disobeyed.
Eichmann carried this out with great efficiency. He saw extermination as a task to be carried out, as a logistical problem. But we shouldn't forget, he saw it as a problem that he was happy to solve.
He's an enforcer, he's an administrator, he is the man who makes the Holocaust happen.
So it wasn't just a case that he was working in an office and overseeing or being involved in the genocide. It was something that he really was passionate about, that he saw it as his mission to try and eradicate the Jewish population of Europe.
He wanted to kill as many Jews as possible. This was his war aim, basically.
Inside is the evidence that tears apart Eichmann's defense. His own paper trail proves he was complicit in mass murder.
It's really chilling to be actually looking at the documents, because Eichmann was the one that put these minutes together. It's a list of the number of Jews in Europe that the Nazis have identified. We know that they managed to exterminate 6 million Jews, but this list contains 11 million, and that's because they've taken into account England, Ireland, Spain, Turkey. It just sort of shows the scale of what they were planning. It's deeply disturbing, just revolting.
Eichmann saw these people not as human, but as cattle, livestock being sent to the abattoir.
The largest deportation in 1943 had 1,758 Jews on one train.
1,758 on one train.
In my quest to determine Adolf Eichmann's place in Hitler's hierarchy, I've seen the evidence that proves he was complicit in genocide. Now, I want to know just how deep his commitment was to carrying it out.
So where are we?
We are at the train station of Unveiled, which is basically at Berlin's west end.
I'm with historian Yoav Sapir at the main departure point for Berlin Jews destined to die in Nazi gas chambers.
So the majority of Jews that were deported from Berlin were deported right where we're standing here.
Right.
Today, Grunewald Station is a Holocaust memorial. But during World War II, it was arguably one of the busiest stations in Europe, at least when it comes to mass murder.
So what are these here?
These are plaques that commemorate each and every deportation that left Berlin between 41 and 45. The largest deportation in 1943 had 1,758 Jews on one train.
1,758 on one train.
For 4 years, Berlin's Jews were rounded up, taken to Grunewald, and crammed into sealed railway cars. They were deprived of food and water, and there was no sanitary facility other than a bucket. Many died on the trains themselves before they even reached the extermination camps.
What's so chilling to me standing on a platform in Berlin is that you see that we're not dealing with genocide on the battlefield. That was obviously had been happening, but we're dealing with genocide that's been planned. It's something that the state has decided to do in the most practical way possible.
They outsourced the killing to these murder factories. And then, of course, the question was, how do we facilitate this transportation? How do we get the Jews from Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on? And that's where Eichmann comes in. That's where Eichmann is in charge in facilitating the kidnapping of families from their homes, forcing them onto trains, making sure that everything works well, the timetables, having the manpower, having the resources, having the trains on time to leave Berlin, to leave Paris, to leave Budapest, on the way to Auschwitz, for example.
At his trial, Eichmann was confronted by witness after witness. They all testified to his role in deporting Jews to their deaths.
dass Eichmann war derjenige, der alle Bestimmungen betreffend Juden getroffen hat, vorgeschlagen hat und auch sogar durchgeführt hat.
פתרון סופי, אז הוא קיבל את התפקיד לבצע את זה.
Despite the damning words, Eichmann continued to deny his direct involvement in their suffering.
So sind an diesen Sachen eine ganze Menge Personen, wenn ich mal so sagen will.
One of the most confusing things about Eichmann was his seeming normality. He comes across, at least, as just sort of your everyday person. That is scary to some extent because it suggests that normal people might actually be capable of this level of atrocity.
Eichmann approaches his role within the final solution with the utmost zeal. I mean, he takes his job really seriously. And that's what makes him such a terrifying figure, because this is a big logistical exercise. His department is quite small, it's just a handful of people. Yet together, under Eichmann's stewardship, they manage to get all these people, these millions of people, sent to their deaths.
Now that we're approaching the end of the war, this is the beginning of 1945. And so the numbers are very small. These are the last Jews of Berlin, those who were trying to survive while hiding.
27th of March, 1945.
At this point in the war, the Third Reich is all but finished. Every Nazi knows it, including Eichmann, but he was determined to finish the job he started.
The last deportation that left Berlin, 18 Jews who almost made it. And then, in spite of everything, were still captured, and by fanatic Nazis, they were being deported right before the Soviets encircled Berlin.
That's less than a month and a half before the end of the war in Europe. This really hits things home for me because they're losing the war. It's the final months of the war. They're about to lose it, and yet they are still deporting Jews to death camps.
Indeed, they were losing the physical war, but for some Nazis, the war against the Jews was more important.
Eichmann's profound commitment to the final solution is nowhere more apparent than on this abandoned train platform. But he'd soon find himself unemployed. The Germans surrendered in May 1945. Hitler was dead, and Germany lay in ruins. Millions of displaced people jammed the roads of Europe, desperately trying to get home. Hidden among them were Nazi fugitives in disguise, including Adolf Eichmann.
After the defeat of Nazi Germany, Eichmann was actually briefly captured by the Americans, but he got away using a fake identity.
For the final chapter in Eichmann's story, I'm turning to historian Tobias Freimüller.
So we're in Spandau right now. Yes, this is the neighborhood of Spandau.
He has the inside scoop on how Eichmann was finally brought to justice 15 years after the war ended.
And it became clear that the man was not his uncle, but it was, in fact, Eichmann himself.
I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Adolf Eichmann was a war criminal who evaded justice for over a decade. He'd hoped to live out his days in Argentina, but his capture in May 1960 changed all that. For the final leg of my journey, I've met up with historian Tobias Freimüller to find out how Eichmann's arrest played out and the impact it had on our understanding of what the Nazis did.
And this is actually the place where the synagogue was until it was destroyed in November 38. And what you see here is actually the names of the Jewish citizens of this neighborhood.
So these are the names of people that were deported?
Yes, exactly.
When the war ends, Eichmann's name is not on the list of top Nazis that the Allies are trying to track down, is he?
No, he's not. The Allies search for the top-ranking Nazis they know. His name is mentioned because it was clear from the very beginning that he was responsible for the deportations, but he was not seen as one of the leading figures who were brought before the court in the main Nuremberg trial.
In Argentina, Eichmann lived under an alias, but his wife and children still carried his name.
He spends, his days in Argentina drifting from menial job to menial job. He tries to make an Angora rabbit farm work. It doesn't work. He's working as a mechanic at a Mercedes-Benz factory. These aren't big jobs for a man who thinks, he deserves more.
Eichmann coped with his lowly place in the world by bragging about his past to other fascists. He also gave extensive interviews to another former SS officer turned journalist.
When he started giving these interviews in the 50s, the plan was to write a book and to publish a book where Eichmann would tell the truth about his history in the Third Reich, and he would publish it under his real name then.
One second, in the 50s he was going to write a book and he was going to talk about what he did and publish it. I find that extraordinary. But I suppose if you're that fanatical and you genuinely believed what you did was right, I suppose something that sounds as crazy as that now, to him, sounded like the logical thing to do.
Absolutely. He wanted to tell the truth from his point of view.
But it would be Eichmann's twisted version of the truth, no one else's. And these memoirs were never published.
So how was Eichmann ultimately apprehended?
It was in '57 when Fritz Bauer received a letter. Fritz Bauer was the state prosecutor of the state of Hesse, and he was known as one of the very few people in the judiciary in West Germany who would really fight for the prosecution of Nazi crimes. So he received a letter from Buenos Aires.
That letter was written by a Jew who'd escaped Nazi Germany in 1938. He'd just learned about his daughter's new boyfriend.
This new boyfriend turned out to be Klaus Eichmann, and it became clear that the man who lived with Klaus was not his uncle, but it was, in fact, Eichmann himself.
I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Fritz Bauer passed the tip on to Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. During a daring operation in May 1960, agents kidnapped Eichmann from a Buenos Aires suburb and smuggled him back to Israel to stand trial.
It was a very, very special case. The trial in Jerusalem found a very huge echo in media worldwide. It was the first trial at all who had such a focus on the Holocaust.
Eichmann's trial was watched by millions. The horrors inflicted on the Jews by the Nazis shocked the world.
Mein Bruder ist schon in Theresienstadt gestorben und meinen Sohn haben sie geführt nach Auschwitz.
We walked for 24 hours without food, and those who could not carry on were shot.
ראיתי ילדים מובלים להריגה. פעם אחת באו אנשי SS.
SS men arrived one morning and took the child away with them. Later, I learned that the child was thrown into the fire.
Until that point, I don't think that the world at large really knew what had happened. They knew there had been atrocities, they knew there had been killings, but they hadn't realized that the Holocaust, and it wasn't really called the Holocaust at this point, was actually this genocidal act.
You had survivors telling their stories in front of a global audience, and really for the first time, bringing narratives of the Holocaust and the systemic nature of persecution and genocide together in one place.
To have this laid out so clearly and to hear the testimonies and to see Eichmann in this glass box made a huge impression, especially on the younger generation, of course, who heard for the first time really what was the real nature of the Nazi crimes.
I think it's at the Eichmann trial where people really start to appreciate the mechanics and the machinery of the genocide. They realize that this isn't just something that just took place on a whim in camps. This was something that was organized, it was designed, it was literally built. Trains and timetables were literally drawn up, and people who were doing it were men like Eichmann.
The trial inspired Jews around the world to recall their own experiences of persecution and loss under the Nazis. It renewed calls for action to hunt down war criminals still on the run. It also forced Germans to confront their past.
So the German society had to learn that responsibility was to be found everywhere, within every bureaucratic system, within every family, and every soldier who took part in the war in the East had seen and probably done terrible things. And this took decades in Germany to really get through.
So the Eichmann's trial really opened up this period of understanding and taking responsibility for the atrocities that Germany had committed, and not just brush it under the carpet and say, oh, Hitler and a few other guys were the people who did it all.
Absolutely.
What does Eichmann's performance at the trial tell us about him?
Well, it tells us pretty much everything that we know about him, finally, because there he was again and again making the argument that he only followed instructions, that he had to do what he did.
Eichmann played a fictitious role at that trial. He made himself out to be the little man. He made himself out to be the cog in the machine. He made himself out to be just the type of bureaucrat that all governments and indeed all dictatorships need if they are to function.
But everyone else in the courtroom saw right through him.
We know that he was very convinced of what he did. And until the very end of the war, he still tried to keep up the deportations, even if it was pretty clear that the war was lost.
Eichmann was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to die. He was hanged on May 31st, 1962. A coward to the end, he never once expressed remorse for his complicity in the murder of millions during the Second World War. Now it's time for me to figure out where this Nazi bureaucrat fits into Hitler's hierarchy.
Eichmann gets as close as I can imagine anyone getting to pure evil.
My travels to Germany have given me a much clearer picture of Adolf Eichmann's role in the Holocaust. Now it's up to us to find out where he fits in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Eichmann ranks among Hitler's most wanted. So what was it about his character and abilities that gave him such an important role in the Holocaust?
You know what he was? He was good at logistics, he was good at organization, and he was good at following where those lines led to their most cruel and horrible conclusions without batting an eye.
Well, I think the thing about Eichmann that I notice is how bureaucratic he was, how administrative he was. Or at least he tries to portray himself in that way, as a quite normal person just going about his business.
And that was certainly how he portrayed himself in the dock in Jerusalem in the 1960s. Well, what you have to remember about Eichmann is that he was a Gestapo officer, and he had an enormous amount of power in determining the mechanics of the Holocaust. He's sometimes called the architect of the Holocaust. I think that maybe some other characters were actually deserve that epithet. But what he did do was he helped manage it, and he managed it very, very fervently.
Eichmann's bureaucratic diligence wasn't just about following orders. To him, his job was everything, and he relished in the administration of terror.
Eichmann was there right from the very beginning. He was up there, exploring the options whether all the Jews should be deported to Madagascar, and ultimately as to where they should be murdered.
And when the Nazis escalated from persecution to mass murder, he went to great lengths to keep the mechanics of genocide running smoothly. The place that really struck me was Grunewald train station in Berlin, and this is where a large number of Berlin Jews were deported to the east to be murdered. And Eichmann was responsible for those deportations. But the thing that was most disturbing about that place was learning that those deportations were happening right up until the final weeks of the war.
It was not incidental. They were diverting resources to it. And at the very end of the war, they ramped up the extermination in order to make sure there wouldn't be any witnesses. In Argentina, Eichmann cavorted with ex-Nazis and would-be Nazis and was quite proud of what he'd accomplished. He bragged about how many Jews he was able to deport to extermination.
You're absolutely right. And he actually said once, "I will jump into my grave laughing that I killed 6 million Jews." This was not a man who was in any way ashamed of what he had done.
So it's really frightening to grasp the fact that what he was doing he believed was right, and he felt a conviction to the cause.
It wasn't so much that he believed what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway, like a psychopath would. He truly believed that his behavior was justified. Now, that doesn't necessarily make his behavior any less evil, but it is, again, scary to think that somebody can undertake immoral behavior and actually feel justified to do so.
Eichmann saw no moral quandary in the bureaucracy of genocide and his central role in it. That is what cements his place among Hitler's most hated disciples. So I'd like to come to a conclusion now of where you think he ranks in the Nazi hierarchy of evil. So Guy, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to put him down in the late teens, which may seem a little bit surprising considering he's this kind of household name amongst Nazis. Why? Yes, his personality is revolting. His anti-Semitism is pure evil. What he did was pure evil. But I think there would have been a lot of people who could have done that job in the Third Reich. So therefore, he doesn't really qualify for something much higher.
Anthony?
I think we all agree that Eichmann wasn't the faceless cog he portrayed himself as. But Eichmann gets as close as I can imagine anyone getting to pure evil. He didn't do this for fame, for money. He did this because he believed it was the right thing to do. His skill at that means that he has to rank a little higher, so I'm going to rank him in number 10.
I agree. I think he's necessary. I think his personality profile is required, and I think that his zeal demonstrates a pure evil. But I do, unfortunately, believe that evil, that position, is replaceable. I rate him a 12.
So obviously the three of you have difference of opinion, but for me, I just can't get over the fact that he was responsible for the deaths of millions. I'm therefore going to agree with Matt's ranking, and he's at number 12. He's the queen of clubs. For his devotion to the logistics of the Holocaust and his unrelenting desire to deport all of Hungary's Jews to their deaths, Adolf Eichmann proves that even a bureaucrat can be responsible for great evil. Karl Dönitz, Hitler's ruthless naval commander.
He was the mastermind.
His U-boats claimed thousands of lives.
There must have been few things more frightening than being hunted by one of these things.
He was a fanatical Nazi who would do anything.
What were conditions like for the slave laborers that were forced to build this bunker?
To see Hitler's evil dream fulfilled.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor?
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted.
In many ways, I feel that Dönitz is the physical embodiment of the classic question, when and how someone who's in the armed forces becomes a war criminal. Guy, how do we decide when that line has actually been crossed?
The answer is very straightforward. You break the rules of war. Of course, it often sounds silly that there should be, rules for warfare. But no, there are rules. The big question we have to ask about Dönitz is whether he actually broke these rules of war.
Matt, I think this calls out for a question here, that if you're in the armed forces, killing is an integral part of your business. How does that affect your morality?
To some extent, I think this is a larger question, beyond just the war criminals we're talking about. The question is, how does morality change in times of war? How does warfare alter one's morality?
Anthony, why do so many people who are in the know about Dönitz's actions during the Second World War still try to present him as just a sailor following orders?
The idea of the clean military has long been a powerful myth, and it's easy to understand why. People want to say that, sure, the regime was criminal, it launched wars of aggression, but the soldiers and the sailors who served were honorable. In the case of the German military in World War II, this is largely a myth, and it's a myth that Dönitz's reputation has benefited from. He also shaped his legacy and his reputation to benefit from that myth.
Based on that, how do you value Dönitz's actions?
I think you have to go to Germany and see the way his legacy is presented and contested.
I'm on my way to Munich, to the Deutsches Museum, one of the world's biggest collections of historical technology. It's home to some unique artifacts that are the perfect starting point for my investigation.
Carla, hi.
Hi.
So this is it?
Yeah.
Carola Dolka is the curator of computer sciences and cryptology here.
There it is.
Yeah, that's the Enigma. The naval Enigma.
It's an Enigma machine, the infamous Nazi encoding device for sending top-secret messages.
Wow. So I've never got this close to one of these things before.
The Nazis used enigmas like this one to radio coded orders to their U-boats in the Atlantic and coordinate their attacks on Allied ships.
So how did the Navy and the U-boats use this machine to communicate with each other?
The one who uses the Enigma always has to type the message to encrypt it or decrypt it. So when you type an X, maybe you get a T. But when you type the X again, it will not be a T again, but maybe an F or something else.
During the Atlantic War, the German commander in charge of issuing those orders was Admiral Karl Dönitz.
Dönitz was a German naval officer. He was the driving force behind building up the German U-boat fleet.
Dönitz masterminded Nazi Germany's submarine warfare. It was he who realized quite how effective submarines would be in essentially blockading Britain and starving her of vital supplies from Canada and the United States.
Dönitz survived the war and was arrested by the Allies, who put him on trial alongside 21 other prominent Nazis at Nuremberg. He was indicted on 3 counts, including multiple conspiracy charges, waging a war of aggression, and committing crimes against the internationally recognized laws of war.
I'll give you one more opportunity of answering my question.
Ja, das weiß ich nicht.
Dönitz was absolutely defiant at Nuremberg. He thought that he was simply a senior armed forces officer who had just been doing his job. He was just a sailor.
He's not very well known among the general public. When people have heard of Dönitz, there's a tendency to think of him as an apolitical career military man rather than somebody involved in war crimes.
But if he really was just an officer following orders as he claimed, then why was he tried as a war criminal alongside top Nazis like Hermann Goering? Who exactly was Hitler's Star Admiral? My search for an answer begins with this. It's a U-1 submarine, the German Navy's very first model, and the standard training vessel when a young Karl Dönitz joined the U-boat corps during the First World War.
So this is obviously the engine room. These things are definitely not built for people my height. Just imagine how hot it would have been. So claustrophobic. And loud, too.
You have to remember that U-boats and submarines were a relatively new form of warfare. You were hiding under the waves, popping up, destroying things, and then slipping away into the deeps and the darkness.
This is the torpedo room, the business end of the U-boat.
During World War I, Dönitz became convinced that the submarine was essential to future naval battles. He wasn't as interested in surface ships as he was in submarines, and he began thinking about how to build up Germany's submarine fleet.
Dönitz's U-boat was sunk by the Allies in the Mediterranean in 1918. He survived and saw the end of the war in a British POW camp. Dönitz spent a year there, fuming over Germany's defeat and drawing up new submarine tactics to beat the Allies if the chance ever came again.
He's preparing for wars and battles that he wants to fight. He wants to get in amongst the thick of it again, and he wants to give the Allies a real hammering.
Dönitz was dreaming of the day Germany's U-boat corps would return and redeem itself in battle. This is the Laber Naval Memorial, just outside the city of Kiel on Germany's north coast.
Wow, amazed at the size of this thing.
It's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, it rises up to 85 meters above sea level.
Dr. Jan Witt is a historian and a leading authority on Dönitz and German naval history.
Now, my understanding is Dönitz's experience as a U-boat commander during the First World War made him a committed submariner. He saw the submarines as the future of naval warfare.
He was a true believer in this, yes, of course. The problem was that, according to the Versailles Treaty, Germany was forbidden to have any U-boats.
But in early 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. Like Dönitz, he too was a veteran of the First World War, bitter about the terms of Germany's surrender. He immediately set out to rebuild Germany's military, and in 1935, U-boats were reintroduced to the Navy.
Yes. So Dönitz now finds himself in the German Navy as part of Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Now, obviously, he's in the armed forces.
Yes.
But to what extent is he actually a committed Nazi?
Well, you have to understand the mindset of the German naval officers at that point of time. By far, most of them welcomed the Nazi regime, especially because this opened new hopes for re-strengthening the German armed forces. And
right.
Of course, also new career opportunities.
So they hoped that the Nazi regime would make the German armed forces great again.
Yes.
Dönitz became a committed Nazi and a rabid admirer of Adolf Hitler. He also embraced Hitler's trademark anti-Semitism.
He periodically made anti-Semitic speeches and made comments along the lines of, can you imagine what Germany would look like today without Hitler? There'd be Jews here, everything would be horrible. He said he'd rather die than live in a country that still had a Jewish presence.
And he was one of the most loyal follower of Hitler. until the very end.
Dönitz was a rising star in the U-boat corps. He began training a new generation of submariners, demanding not only total devotion to duty, but to Hitler and Nazism as well.
And so he could build up again the German U-boat force and train his U-boatmen according to his new tactical ideas. And this is how he led his U-boat warfare.
In September 1939, Hitler once again plunged the world into war. Karl Dönitz's shot at revenge had finally arrived, and his U-boats were about to wreak havoc on the Allies.
I can almost imagine what it would be like to sort of spot a convoy and then sending out a message to move in for the kill.
I'm on a mission to determine where Nazi submarine commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. Right now, I'm on Germany's north coast with Dr. Jan Witt, investigating Dönitz's actions during the Second World War. Wow. So that's a real Type 7 U-boat.
Exactly, the last surviving in the world.
Amazing. Can we take a closer look?
Yes, of course.
Fabulous.
Mind your head.
I would definitely be too tall for a U-boat crewman. How many men traditionally served on this type of U-boat?
Up to 50 men.
50 men?
50.
So you had 50 men
crammed inside this tube.
That's unbelievable. Oh my God, I can't imagine 50 men fitting in here.
2 toilets for 50 men.
2 toilets?
2 toilets. No showers, and the aft toilet was usually used as a provision store. So it was basically 1 toilet for 50 men.
So, I mean, it must have smelled disgusting in here.
Yes.
Wow. U-boat crews endured these cramped conditions for months at a time as they prowled the North Atlantic. So this is the radio room?
Exactly, as you can hear
yes.
from the wireless Morse code. So there you find all the different types of radio, but also the Enigma.
Oh wow, so the Enigma machine would have been in here?
Exactly.
It's here that U-boats received Admiral Dönitz's orders of attack during the all-important Battle of the Atlantic.
The shadow of the conquering German armies covered Western Europe.
In June 1940, Hitler drove the Allies across the English Channel. Britain was now isolated, and Dönitz saw his chance to knock the nation out of the war.
The Atlantic is absolutely essential for getting vital supplies from Canada and the United States across to Great Britain. These are absolutely essential lifelines for Britain to stay in the war.
And one of the things that made U-boats so effective in the Second World War was the wolf pack tactic. Now, that was something that Karl Dönitz came up with. Can you explain that to me?
It stems from the experience of the First World War. Dönitz started to think about different means of attack, new tactics, and so he came up with the idea not to have the U-boats attacking convoys individually, but in groups.
August 8, 1940, the German war machine opened the Battle of Britain with an all-out assault on coastal shipping, on the convoys that were keeping beleaguered England alive.
So part of the U-boats simply keep the escorts busy, while the other U-boats attack the actual convoy ships, the merchant vessels, and sink them. This was very, very effective, especially in the first stages of war, when the British had not enough escorts available.
By firing on unarmed merchant ships, Dönitz was engaging in a taboo tactic known as unrestricted submarine warfare.
Dutch tanker, British tanker. Again and again the torpedoes struck.
Unrestricted submarine warfare is essentially a tactic by which you are going to torpedo any ship that basically comes within your periscope. It doesn't matter whether you target a neutral merchant ship. If that's sailing across the Atlantic to give some supplies to the United Kingdom, then that's a valid target. That's a crime. Winston Churchill famously observed that actually, if the Allies had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, they probably would have lost the Second World War.
Dönitz seemed willing to do anything to achieve victory, even if it meant killing unarmed civilians by the thousands.
Many believe that the perfect soldier may be somebody who has, say, loose moral codes. Certainly that type of individual might be very good at doing the dirty work, at being able to undertake the types of actions that would cause moral and ethical repercussions for other individuals.
There must have been few things more frightening in the Second World War than being hunted by one of these things.
I think so, yes. Imagine yourself standing on a merchant vessel in a dark night and a stormy night, and your vessel gets torpedoed. You go down and you have to go to a raft or into a lifeboat. And, well, I think the first thing is you're done for. That's it, the end of your life.
Dönitz's U-boats continued to wreak havoc on Allied supply convoys into early 1941. But their dominance was about to end.
There are essentially three ways in which the tide turns against Dönitz and his U-boat campaign. First of all, the Allies managed to crack the Enigma code. So we're starting to have a good idea of where these U-boat packs are because we're intercepting their signals. Secondly, there's another massive technological advance called ASDIC, in which you can start actually pinpointing the U-boats under the water with a form of radar and then just drop depth charges on them and just blow them up. And the third thing, of course, is the US then enters the war, and with it, greater naval power. That's another big threat to Dönitz.
The longer the war went, the better the defenses became, and the more refined that the anti-U-boat tactics became, and new weapons were introduced. The role of these U-boats more and more changed from being the hunters to being the hunted.
Right.
The results were devastating for Dönitz's U-boat corps.
The casualty rates amongst U-boat crews is enormous. It's 75%. I mean, that is bigger than any other type of unit in the Second World War.
But that didn't stop Dönitz demanding construction of more U-boats and sending crew after crew into what was becoming a slaughter.
I can't think of a much more unpleasant death than being on the receiving end of an Allied depth charge attack when I'm in a U-boat. You must have felt entombed and helpless, knowing at any time that hull could crack and the North Atlantic could just pour into your U-boat and you're going to be drowned with all your mates. It must have been horrific.
Karl Dönitz's ruthlessness on the high seas is well documented. But he committed a host of other atrocities that are far less known.
Passiert, und selbst nach der Kapitulation hat es noch solche Hinrichtungen gegeben.
I'm on a mission to find out where Nazi submarine commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. So far, I've seen how he embraced Nazism and unleashed his U-boat wolf packs in an attempt to starve Britain. Now I've come to Hamburg to investigate another side of Dönitz's cruelty.
Where are you taking me?
James, ich führe...
René Sinenko is a historian and an expert in Nazi recruiting during the Second World War.
Das ist das sogenannte Deserteursdenkmal. Also der Gedenkort für die Deserteure der Wehrmacht und andere Opfer der NS-Militärjustiz. Das ist der offizielle Titel, James, yes? You must read from the opposite side.
So we have to go inside to read the text here?
Yes.
Okay, let's go inside then.
As long as there's been war, there have been deserters. There have been people who literally desert their post, flee, and refuse to continue to fight in the war that they're supposed to fight in. What makes desertion stand out in the case of Nazi Germany is the fact that desertion takes on a much clearer moral character when it's a matter of refusing to participate in a war of aggression, in a war of genocide.
What would have happened if you were caught deserting from the German armed forces in the Second World War?
Deserteure im Zweiten Weltkrieg wurden bei der Fahnenflucht, wenn sie verhaftet worden sind, vor ein Kriegsgericht gestellt und verurteilt. Wenn sie Glück hatten, sind sie mit einigen Monaten Haft, Militärhaft davongekommen, aber viele, viele Tausend von ihnen sind zum Tode verurteilt worden. Auch hier in Hamburg. Wir haben insgesamt 226 Namen von Soldaten, die hier in Hamburg am Höldigbaum, Schießplatz Höldigbaum, hingerichtet worden sind. Aber wahrscheinlich waren es wesentlich mehr.
How did Karl Dönitz view and treat deserters?
Ja, du weißt ja, dass Dönitz war der Nachfolger von Hitler, nachdem Hitler Selbstmord, Suizid begangen hat. Er war oberster Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht, nicht nur der Marine, sondern auch der Wehrmacht. Und hat noch in den letzten Kriegstagen viele Deserteure oder viele Fahnenflüchtige, die zum Tode verurteilt worden sind, musste er als oberster Kriegsherr das Todesurteil bestätigen. Das heißt, es sind noch eine Anzahl von Deserteuren wegen Dönitz seiner Bestätigung hingerichtet worden.
Hitler had issued guidelines for the punishment of desertion, and these guidelines saw some mitigating circumstances. If you deserted out of youthful foolishness, there were ways that you could escape the death penalty. But for Dönitz, this wasn't true at all, and he issued a competing ordinance that called for the death penalty in every case of desertion.
Obwohl der Krieg schon fast zu Ende war und in einigen Fällen war die Kapitulation schon passiert, und selbst nach der Kapitulation hat es noch solche Hinrichtungen gegeben. Dönitz war also ein Scharfmacher, ein Durchhaltegeneral, der unbedingt wollte, dass der Krieg in den Gleisen, so wie Adolf Hitler das befohlen hat, zu Ende geführt wird. Das heißt, auch Dönitz selbst hat aus dem Krieg nichts gelernt. Und deshalb sehe ich Dönitz natürlich als Kriegsverbrecher, der er war, sehr, sehr kritisch.
But back in 1946, the question of whether Dönitz was a criminal in the eyes of the law had yet to be resolved. That was the job of the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials. During the proceedings, the prosecution confronted Dönitz with a damning piece of evidence about Nazi treatment of Allied commandos caught behind German lines.
It's Dönitz who's enforcing Hitler's commando order, which stipulates that any commandos caught should be summarily shot, executed right there and then. This is a flagrant breach of the rules of war.
I asked you yesterday about the secrecy standard of the original Führer order that the shooting of uniformed prisoners acting on military orders must be carried out even after they have surrendered voluntarily and asked for pardon.
Most sides accept the fact that if you aren't wearing your uniform and you're spying, then basically you deserve to be executed. But commandos? No, commandos are special troops, but they're still just regular troops in uniforms fighting, under the rules of war. Hitler doesn't like them, Dönitz doesn't like them, and he's happy to help them get executed.
Do you agree that that is a reason for giving top secrecy to this document?
Ja, das weiß ich nicht. Das kann ich nicht sagen, weil ich diesen Kommandobefehl nicht herausgegeben habe.
I'll give you one more opportunity of answering my question. Will you answer it or won't you?
Ja, das will ich tun. Ich halte das für möglich, zumal der Jurist hier dieser Ansicht ist. Ob das stimmt, weiß ich nicht, weil ich den Befehl nicht herausgegeben habe.
Dönitz has got problems when it comes to defending himself because it's Dönitz who's behind enforcing Hitler's commando order.
We hear a lot about the fact that they were just following orders. That also happens to be one of the primary ways in which you can use justification to try to reduce the cognitive dissonance that you may be experiencing inside. There is some evidence there that they do have some recognition that what they were doing was in fact wrong, or else they wouldn't need the justification in the first place.
But the prosecution wasn't finished with Dönitz yet. They had even more shocking evidence for the court. They accused him of using slaves.
12,000 concentration camp prisoners will be employed in the shipyards as additional labor. Now that is your document. May we take it that you were familiar with the fact of the existence of concentration camps.
I have never denied it.
And do we have any idea how many forced laborers lost their lives building this thing?
I think about 1,600 victims.
My mission to determine where Nazi naval commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil has brought me to the German town of Rechem, near the North Sea coast, home to this massive concrete bunker called the Valentin submarine pens.
What part of the bunker are we in here?
We are now at the end of the whole production line. This place was meant to produce submarines on a kind of assembly line. And the last
Dr. Markus Meyer is a historian and an expert in Nazi naval history.
This place is absolutely ginormous. I'm still trying to get my head around how big it is. Why did they build this?
They wanted to build submarines, and they needed a kind of place that was protected from Allied airstrikes. And so they decided to build this huge construction, which should have been bomb-proof, against the biggest bombs they had at that time.
By early 1943, the tide of war had turned against the Nazis. Allied bombers were attacking German industrial centers day and night, threatening to shut down arms production. Hitler was looking for anything that could help him strike back. Karl Dönitz was convinced he had the answer, in the form of the powerful new Type 21 submarine.
The Type 21 was an attempt to try and take out as many Allied vessels as possible.
Exactly. Dönitz was responsible for this project. This was the most important project of the German Navy at that time. And Dönitz was convinced that the Type 21 would win the war, basically, and to sink more ship space than the Allies could rebuild.
But to build the Type 21s, he needed a factory safe from the relentless Allied air raids. Dönitz needed a place like this.
How big actually is this structure?
About 419 meters long. It covers a ground about 5 soccer grounds. We have walls at the moment at about 4.60 meters, and the roof would have been brought to 7 meters.
So the walls are 4.5 meters thick?
Exactly, and that should have been thick enough to protect the whole production process against airstrikes.
Building a structure on this scale called for a massive labor force. But the vast majority of German men were needed for the war effort. So the Nazis found another way.
The key thing about the Valentin bunker is that it was constructed using massive numbers of slave laborers.
They were concentration camp prisoners, mainly Soviets and Poles, along with Italian POWs and French conscripts, all shipped to Rechem and forced at gunpoint to build the Valentin submarine pen.
12,000 concentration camp prisoners will be employed in the shipyards as additional labor. Now that is your document.
Dönitz used slaves. I think it's a real measure of Dönitz's brutality and, frankly, evil that he's requesting 12,000 slaves.
What were conditions like for the slave laborers that were forced to build this bunker?
Very bad. They had nearly nothing to eat. The average weight of a prisoner at that time was about 45 kilograms. So say they suffered from having nothing to eat and nothing to drink. They had to do very hard work, carrying sacks of cement about 50 kilograms, so more than their own weight. They were forced to work very quickly. They were heavily guarded. There was nearly no possibility to take a break, just a short break. So it was working nearly 12 hours a day. And after that, you had the life in the camps. also guarded, also bad conditions when it comes to what beds you get and what kind of hygiene standards you have. There were nearly no standards for hygiene.
And do we have any idea how many forced laborers lost their lives building this thing?
We are talking about 1,600 victims during the 2 years.
If they had managed to finish this bunker and the facilities inside it, would that have changed anything?
From, I think, autumn 42 on, that was impossible. The Germans could have built boat after boat after boat, but the Americans and the Canadians were faster. So the idea to sink more ship space than the other could rebuild was a fantasy.
Everything about Dönitz's actions towards the end of the war shows that he was a much more fanatical Nazi than was previously suspected. He was fighting to the bitter end.
But before that end, Karl Dönitz would receive a shocking and totally unexpected promotion.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor?
I'm on a journey to find out where Nazi naval commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. On May 1st, 1945, millions of war-weary Germans tuned in to hear an unfamiliar voice deliver some momentous news.
Unser Führer Adolf Hitler ist gefallen. Der Führer hat mich zu seinem Nachfolger bestimmt.
He was Hitler's hand-picked successor as head of state, not as Führer, but as Reichspräsident, or President of the Reich.
It's quite a surprising choice. You would have thought that someone like Himmler or Goering or some of these other far more sort of kind of big Nazi political names would have taken that job.
I've come to the northern port city of Flensburg to find out more about Dönitz's brief tenure as president in the final days of Nazi Germany.
Dr. Pust?
Yeah.
James, very nice to meet you.
Dieter Pust.
Dr. Dieter Pust is a historian, author, and a leading authority on the city's history.
Nice to see you in Flensburg.
The city is the longtime home of the German Naval Academy, and it's where Dönitz chose to make his final stand as the only man apart from Hitler to lead the Third Reich.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor rather than Himmler, Goering, or a number of other prominent Nazi leaders?
Because Dönitz has been the truest follower of Hitler. He has not connection to politics.
So the other members of the leadership had discredited themselves in Hitler's eyes.
Yes.
So Dönitz was the natural successor for Hitler because he was someone who had not betrayed Hitler.
Dönitz has always been loyal, Dönitz has always been true. There's none of the politicking nonsense about Dönitz. He wasn't that kind of political figure, you know, always part of the center of the Nazi soap opera.
When Dönitz announced Hitler's death to the German people, he stated that Hitler had died fighting at the head of his troops in Berlin. He didn't reveal the fact that Hitler had committed suicide. Why was that?
Es war, den Mythos über Hitler aufrechtzuerhalten. Auch in Bezug auf die Soldaten und jeden Deutschen, der seine Pflicht erfüllen müsste, bis zum Letzten. Und den Mythos aufrechtzuerhalten, dass Hitler also nach seinen eigenen Grundsätzen dann sozusagen bis zum Ende für das deutsche Volk sich aufgeopfert hat. Und das war, wie gesagt, die letzte große Lüge des NS-Systems.
Dönitz was unfailingly loyal. In Hitler's political testament, when he entrusts Dönitz with the position of President of the Reich, he says that Dönitz should carry out the military struggle using all means available.
By this time, Berlin was in ruins, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a few scattered pockets of resistance. Their war was utterly lost. Nonetheless, Dönitz ordered German troops facing the Soviets to stand and fight.
So where are you taking me now?
Ja, wir sind auf dem Weg zu einer besonderen Station hier in Flensburg. Und zwar dem Ort, an dem Dönitz zuletzt hier in der Stadt gewesen ist.
All right, let's go in.
In front of us is the building, where for a few fleeting weeks in May 1945, Karl Dönitz ran the final Nazi government.
The Flensburg government took up offices at the Naval Academy, and it actually had some of its ministries on ships in the water surrounding the Naval Academy. This was a very strange 21 days in German history.
Stranger still was Dönitz's plan to save the crumbling Reich.
It's a measure of how actually detached the Nazi leadership, and in particular Dönitz, was from the realities of the situation, that he calls upon the Western allies to team up with the remnants of the Nazi forces to actually prosecute a war against the Soviet Union.
Hat zunächst versucht, Waffenstillstandsverhandlungen zu führen mit den Westmächten, mit dem Argument, in Zukunft würde der Feind aller, der Sowjetkommunismus sein im Osten. Und darauf sind aber die Alliierten nicht eingegangen.
So the Allies were going to keep fighting Germany until they committed to an agreement of unconditional surrender.
Yes.
From Allied headquarters aboard the Patria at Flensburg, North Germany, orders go out for the arrest of the last top Nazi.
Having run out of options, Dönitz announced Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th, 1945. The war in Europe was over.
Now the Führer of the beaten Third Reich, Grand Admiral Dönitz himself, comes out under Allied arrest. He walks through a tunnel in the Flensburg compound to imprisonment.
Und von hier aus erfolgte dann die Überführung der prominenten Gefangenen zum Flugplatz Schäferhaus. Und von dort erfolgte dann die Überführung zunächst nach Niedersachsen und dann schließlich nach Nürnberg zum Nürnberger Prozess.
So you're telling me that after Dönitz was arrested, he would have stood right where I'm standing here?
Ja.
Wow.
Hat sich dann noch beschwert, dass nicht richtig als Militär in Uniform und so weiter zur Kenntnis genommen wurde von den Alliierten, die ihn dann abgeführt haben.
And he stood here when it had all ended for him, that he had been arrested, his time as the leader of Germany was over, and after this moment it was really just a short while before he was going to stand trial at Nuremberg.
Dönitz est inculpé des crimes faits par les premiers, deuxième et troisième chefs de l'acte d'accusation.
On October 15th, 1946, after nearly a year of testimony, the Nuremberg verdicts were read, and Karl Dönitz learned his fate.
Dönitz was indicted on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, waging a war of aggression, and crimes against the laws of war. He was found not guilty on the first count, but convicted on the second 2.
Dönitz was found guilty of committing heinous war crimes, but while many of his fellow Nazis were sentenced to hang, he received just 10 years imprisonment.
I think Dönitz's sentence was far too short. I think he got lucky because he had a decent lawyer. And what's very difficult when you're prosecuting a man like Dönitz is that if you start accusing him of waging unrestricted submarine warfare, then you better be sure that your own side hasn't done the same thing. And Dönitz's lawyer had actually got an affidavit from the US naval commander Nimitz to say that he too had engaged in a similar type of warfare. And this is what Dönitz can rely upon for his defense. He's going to say, yeah, maybe I did something bad, but so did you, so why are you prosecuting just me?
Standing here with Dieter on the very spot where Dönitz was taken into custody, I'm left with one last question.
After the war, did Dönitz ever express regret or remorse for the crimes he committed?
He said he has only so gewesen, dass danach die Pflicht erfüllt hat und insofern sich keinen Grund gesehen hat, sich da zu entschuldigen oder.
Karl Dönitz was released in 1956, the first of the major Nazis serving time to be set free. He died in 1980 at age 89.
Now it's time to find out where Dönitz ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
He is up to his neck in crimes against humanity.
My journey has given me new insight into Karl Dönitz's fanatical belief in Hitler and Nazism, and revealed the truth about his use of slave labor in a pointless attempt to prolong the war. It's also demonstrated his complete lack of any remorse. Now it's time for us to decide where he should sit in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
At Nuremberg, Dönitz is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Do you think that's fair for his actions during the Second World War?
No, I think it's pitiful. There were submarines operating with utmost ruthlessness against merchant shipping. Many innocent men, women and children were sent to their deaths by Dönitz's men on his orders. So, as far as I'm concerned, he is up to his neck in crimes against humanity.
The place that I went to that had the biggest impact on me was the Valentin U-boat bunker. This was a structure that was built under Dönitz's orders by slave labor, and construction started at a time when the war was already unwinnable for Nazi Germany.
What the building of that bunker shows is that you really can't separate the military and what it did from the human rights violations and other atrocities of the Nazi state. It's a U-boat bunker. It's built with slave labor. Dönitz has unclean hands in the crimes of the Third Reich, and you see it in the building of that bunker.
One of the advantages Dönitz has as a sailor is that the Third Reich's Navy, of course, is not directly involved in the Holocaust in the same way as the Army and the SS and all these other apparatuses of the Nazi state. And it's that distance, or perceived distance, that makes Dönitz look a little bit cleaner than other Nazis.
Matt, given Dönitz's actions during the Battle of the Atlantic and his willing use of slave labor, what does that say about his morality?
Well, the average soldier's sense of morality is going to shift to some extent in times of war. There's no question about that. And yet, Dönitz's actions do seem to go far beyond what would be considered to be a normal shift in morality. His behaviors are certainly immoral.
And that relatively light sentence had a detrimental effect on the process of reckoning in post-war Germany, because it allowed Dönitz to retire and to write his memoirs and to peddle his narrative of who he was and what he did.
Well, that seems to be evidence of a denial of responsibility. And that is a feature of some individuals who have committed atrocious crimes. In fact, they'll often see themselves as the victim for having been locked up.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the problems that Nuremberg had is that there were some Allied commanders who had committed probably very similar crimes to those committed by Dönitz, and that's why the tribunal went a little bit more easily on him than it actually should have done.
So what I'd like to do now is come to a conclusion as to where you think Dönitz ranks in the hierarchy of evil. Anthony, what are your thoughts?
Being an admiral and being Hitler's successor as head of state aren't things to dismiss. At the same time, I don't think Dönitz was anywhere near as central to the atrocities committed by the Nazi state as some of the other people we've discussed here. So I rank him number 26.
Guy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Dönitz, in a normal war, quote unquote, and if he had worked for a normal regime, quote unquote, and done the actions he had done, would be a major war criminal. I'll put him straight into the top 10. But there are so many other players in the Nazi pantheon who are a lot worse than him. So I'm going to go about 24.
Okay, and Matt?
I'm going to largely agree with my historian colleagues here. I would rank him at 25.
So it's interesting, the three of you basically have come to an almost unanimous conclusion about where he should rank in the mid-20s. Matt, I have to agree with you. I think 25 is where he should be ranked. He's therefore the 8 of spades.
Karl Dönitz was a fanatical Nazi whose tactics and orders claimed thousands of innocent lives. As Hitler's successor, he tried to prolong the war. For that, he ranks 25th among Hitler's most wanted.